The doctor's hands were shaking as he held the envelope. After 12 years of darkness, after 12 years of his son never seeing his face, the test results inside could change everything. He tore it open, read the first line, and felt his knees buckle. The words on the page were impossible. They couldn't be real, but they were. If this story touches your heart, please subscribe to Kindness Hub and hit that like button. We share stories that remind us of the goodness in humanity, and I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Now, let me tell you about a father's journey that will restore your faith in miracles. Michael Chen had dreamed of becoming a father his entire life. Growing up as an only child in a quiet suburb of Portland, Oregon, he'd spent countless afternoons imagining what it would be like to teach his own son to ride a bike, to throw a baseball, to see the wonder in a child's eyes when they experienced something for the first time. When he met Sarah at a medical conference in Seattle, he knew he'd found the person he wanted to build that dream with. She was a pediatric nurse with a laugh that could light up a room and a heart that seemed to have infinite capacity for caring. They married 2 years later in a small ceremony overlooking the Columbia River. The next few years were filled with the busy chaos of two medical professionals building their careers. Michael worked as a family physician at a community clinic, often staying late to see patients who couldn't afford to miss work during regular hours. Sarah worked the night shift at Children's Hospital, coming home with stories that were equal parts heartbreaking and inspiring. When Sarah discovered she was pregnant, they cried together in their kitchen, holding each other as the evening light streamed through the windows. Michael immediately began planning. He painted the nursery a soft sage green. He assembled the crib, reading the instructions 3 times to make sure every bolt was perfect. He bought books about fatherhood and stacked them on his nightstand, reading a chapter each night before bed. The pregnancy progressed normally for 7 months. Sarah's belly grew round and full. They learned they were having a boy and spent evenings debating names, finally settling on Daniel, after Michael's grandfather. Michael would rest his hand on Sarah's stomach and feel his son kick, imagining all the adventures they would share. Then, during a routine ultrasound in the 32nd week, the technician's face changed. She excused herself and returned with the attending physician. There were irregularities, they said. Abnormalities in the optical development. They needed more tests, better imaging, specialists. The next 2 weeks were a blur of appointments and medical jargon that Michael understood all too well from his training. Bilateral anophthalmia. The words felt like stones in his chest. Their son's eyes had not developed properly in the womb. Daniel would be born blind. Completely, permanently blind. Michael sat in his car in the hospital parking lot after that diagnosis, gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. He was a doctor. He was supposed to fix things, to heal people, to make things better. But there was nothing he could do about this. The grief came in waves, not for himself, but for all the things his son would never see. Sarah's smile, the Oregon coastline, the stars, his own father's face. That night, Sarah found him standing in the nursery, staring at the sage green walls. She took his hand and said something he would never forget. She said every child is born perfect in their own way, and their job wasn't to fix Daniel or mourn what he wouldn't have. Their job was to love him fiercely and help him navigate a world that wasn't built for him. Michael pulled her close and felt something shift inside him. She was right. He had to be more than his grief. He had to be Daniel's father. Daniel was born on a rainy October morning, 6 weeks before his due date. He was small, just over 4 pounds, with a thick head of dark hair and tiny fingers that gripped Michael's thumb with surprising strength. Where his eyes should have been were smooth skin and delicate tissue. Michael held his son for the first time in the NICU, listening to the beep of monitors and the whisper of his wife's exhausted breathing, and made a silent promise. He would give this boy the richest, fullest life possible. The first year was harder than Michael had prepared for. Daniel struggled to gain weight. He startled easily at sounds, crying for hours when he couldn't make sense of the world around him. Michael and Sarah took turns walking him through the house at 3 in the morning, describing everything they passed. This is the hallway. These are family photos on the wall. Here's the kitchen. Can you smell the coffee? They learned to communicate through touch and sound. Michael would tap out rhythms on Daniel's palm and feel him tap back. Sarah sang constantly, letting her voice be the beacon that told Daniel where she was in a room. They child-proofed every corner, every sharp edge, creating a safe space for Daniel to explore as he grew. By the time Daniel was 2, he was walking, using his hands to map the furniture and walls. Michael watched his son navigate their home with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. Daniel was so brave, so determined, never complaining about the darkness that was all he'd ever known. But Michael couldn't shake the weight of what his son was missing. The guilt ate at him in quiet moments. He would see other children at the park, pointing excitedly at dogs or airplanes or ice cream trucks, and feel a physical ache in his chest. He threw himself into research, reading every study about vision restoration, experimental treatments, stem cell therapy. He called colleagues across the country, asking about clinical trials and new procedures. But the answer was always the same. Daniel's condition was too severe. The eyes simply hadn't formed. There was nothing to repair. When Daniel turned 3, they enrolled him in a special education program for visually impaired children. Michael drove him to the center every morning, a renovated school building in southeast Portland with teachers trained in orientation and mobility. Daniel thrived there. He learned to use a long cane, tapping it ahead of him with confidence. He learned Braille, his small fingers racing across the raised dots. He made friends, other children who understood his world. Michael volunteered at the center whenever his schedule allowed, wanting to understand his son's experience. He tried navigating the building blindfolded, and lasted less than 10 minutes before panic set in. The disorientation was overwhelming. Yet Daniel moved through those hallways like he owned them, laughing and calling out to his teachers by name based on the sound of their footsteps. One afternoon, Michael sat in on Daniel's music class. The teacher, an older woman named Mrs. Patterson who had been blind since birth, was teaching the children to play simple instruments. Daniel picked up a small keyboard and, without any instruction, began pressing keys in patterns. He tilted his head, listening to the notes, then played them again with slight variations. Mrs. Patterson knelt beside him and asked if he liked how the sounds changed. Daniel nodded and said the high notes felt like bubbles and the low notes felt like thunder. After class, Mrs. Patterson pulled Michael aside. She told him that Daniel had a gift, a rare sensitivity to sound and pattern. She suggested private piano lessons. Michael was skeptical at first, worried about pushing his son too hard, but Sarah encouraged it. If Daniel loved music, they should nurture that love. They found a piano teacher named James who had experience working with blind students. Twice a week, Michael would take Daniel to James's studio, a cozy room above a bookstore in northwest Portland. James was patient and kind, teaching Daniel to find middle C by touch, to understand octaves through the physical spacing of keys. Within 6 months, Daniel was playing simple melodies. Within a year, he was playing Beethoven. Music became Daniel's language. When he was frustrated, he would play harsh, dissonant chords. When he was happy, the melodies soared and danced. Michael would sit in the studio during lessons, listening to his 7-year-old son coax emotions from an instrument that he couldn't see, and feel something close to peace. Maybe Daniel's life would be different from what Michael had imagined, but it wouldn't be less. It would just be his own. Still, Michael struggled. He attended support groups for parents of disabled children, but found himself unable to fully connect. Everyone else seemed to have reached acceptance, seemed to have moved past the grief. Michael smiled and nodded during meetings, but inside, he was still searching for a cure that didn't exist. On Daniel's 8th birthday, they threw a party at their house. Daniel's classmates came, along with their parents and siblings. Michael watched sighted children play games that Daniel couldn't fully participate in, and felt the familiar ache. But then Daniel sat at their piano and played Happy Birthday, adding flourishes and variations that made everyone laugh and clap. The other kids gathered around him, amazed, asking how he could play without looking at his hands. Daniel grinned and said he didn't need to look because he could feel the music in his fingers. One of the mothers approached Michael afterward. She introduced herself as Rebecca, mother to one of Daniel's classmates. She told him that her daughter talked about Daniel constantly, about how brave he was and how beautiful his music sounded. She said Daniel had taught her daughter that people are capable of extraordinary things, even when the world tells them they can't be. Michael thanked her, his tight, and excused himself to the bathroom where he cried quietly, overwhelmed by the collision of pride and sorrow. The years continued. Daniel grew taller, his dark hair always slightly messy, his smile quick and genuine. He attended a mainstream school with support from a vision specialist, learning to advocate for himself and navigate a world designed for sighted people. He joined the school orchestra, his piano skills translating beautifully to other instruments. By middle school, he was playing clarinet and composing his own pieces. Michael's medical practice continued to grow. He was respected in the community, known for taking time with patients and never rushing appointments. But there was a distance that had grown between him and Sarah, a quiet tension born from years of unexpressed grief. Sarah had moved forward, embracing Daniel's life as it was. Michael loved his son fiercely, but couldn't let go of the what-ifs. When Daniel was 12, he came home from school excited about a science project. His class was studying genetics and hereditary traits. The teacher had suggested students could do optional DNA testing to learn about their ancestry and genetic markers. Daniel wanted to participate. He thought it would be cool to understand his genetic makeup, to see if there were other traits hidden in his code. Michael hesitated. He knew that genetic testing would likely confirm the random mutation that had caused Daniel's anophthalmia. He wasn't sure he wanted that information, wasn't sure he wanted Daniel to see himself reduced to a genetic abnormality. But Sarah pointed out that Daniel had every right to understand his own biology, and knowledge was always better than ignorance. They ordered the testing kit. Daniel swabbed his cheek and mailed it off, chatting about what percentage Irish or Italian he might be. Michael filed it away mentally, not expecting much beyond ancestry percentages and perhaps some carrier status for common conditions. 6 weeks later, the results arrived in their mailbox. Michael opened the envelope alone in his home office on a quiet Saturday morning. Sarah had taken Daniel to his piano lesson. The house was still. The ancestry results were unsurprising. Mostly Chinese and European, matching Michael and Sarah's backgrounds. But there was another section, a detailed genetic health report that Michael hadn't paid for but had apparently been included. His eyes scanned the technical language, the chromosomal analysis, the genetic markers. And then he saw it. A note flagged by the testing company's medical team. An abnormality that required immediate attention. Michael's medical training kicked in as he read the details, and the paper nearly slipped from his hands. The test showed that Daniel had a rare genetic condition called Leber congenital amaurosis type 10, or LCA10. But that wasn't what made Michael's world tilt. What made his breath catch was the notation that explained LCA10 was caused by a mutation in the CEP290 gene, and unlike traditional anophthalmia, some forms of LCA10 had recently become treatable through gene therapy. Michael read the paragraph 3 times. He pulled up medical journals on his computer, searching for recent studies. His hands were shaking so hard he could barely type. There, in a publication from just 8 months earlier, was a clinical trial showing successful vision restoration in patients with CEP290 mutations. The treatment used a modified virus to deliver a functional copy of the gene directly to the retina. But Daniel didn't have retinas. He didn't have fully formed eyes. Michael's hope crashed as quickly as it had risen. He kept reading anyway, desperate now, clicking through study after study. And then he found it. A case report from a hospital in Philadelphia. A 12-year-old patient with severe LCA10 and minimal ocular development had received the gene therapy. The doctors hadn't expected much, maybe some light perception at best. The patient had gained functional vision. Michael stood up so fast his chair rolled backward and hit the wall. This couldn't be real. He called the hospital in Philadelphia, his voice barely steady as he asked to speak with the research team. He was transferred 4 times before reaching a clinical coordinator who confirmed that yes, they had ongoing trials, and yes, they were seeing unprecedented results in pediatric patients with CEP290 mutations. The coordinator asked if Michael was calling on behalf of a patient. Michael said yes, his son, and could barely get the words out. The coordinator asked him to send Daniel's genetic test results and medical history. They would review his case and determine if he was a candidate. Michael hung up and sat in silence. Hope was a dangerous thing. He had lived with grief for so long, had built his life around accepting the permanence of Daniel's blindness. The thought that it might not be permanent, that there might be a chance, was almost too painful to consider. If he let himself hope and it didn't work, he wasn't sure he could survive it. Sarah came home with Daniel an hour later. Michael heard them laughing in the hallway, heard Daniel describing a new piece he was learning. Michael walked out of his office and looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw a boy who had never once complained about his blindness, who had built a beautiful life in the darkness. He pulled Sarah aside and showed her the results. She read them twice, her hand covering her mouth. They decided not to tell Daniel yet. Not until they knew more. Not until there was something concrete to tell. The next 3 weeks were agony. Michael sent Daniel's complete medical history to Philadelphia. He followed up every other day, professional but persistent. Finally, the call came. Daniel was a candidate. His genetic profile matched the criteria. They wanted to see him for a comprehensive evaluation. Michael and Sarah sat Daniel down that evening. They explained, as simply as they could, that the genetic test had revealed something unexpected. There might be a treatment. A chance, not a guarantee, but a real chance that he could gain some vision. Daniel was quiet for a long time. Then he asked what they meant by some vision. Michael admitted they didn't know. Maybe light and shadow. Maybe shapes. Maybe more. Maybe nothing at all. The treatment was experimental. Daniel asked if it would hurt. Michael said there would be surgery, and recovery, and it wouldn't be easy. Daniel nodded slowly. Then he asked the question that broke Michael's heart. He asked if his parents wanted him to do it because they were sad that he was blind. Sarah knelt in front of Daniel and took his hands. She told him that they loved him exactly as he was, that he was perfect and whole and had never needed fixing. But this was his choice. If he wanted to try, they would support him. If he didn't want to risk it, they would support that too. Daniel thought about it for 2 days. He asked his piano teacher what he thought. He asked Mrs. Patterson from his old preschool. He asked his best friend Marcus, who was also blind. Everyone told him the same thing. It was his decision, and whatever he chose would be right. Finally, Daniel told his parents he wanted to try. Not because he was unhappy being blind, but because he was curious. He wanted to know what blue looked like. He wanted to see his mother's face. He wanted to watch his own fingers on the piano keys. They flew to Philadelphia in late spring. The hospital was enormous and intimidating, but the research team was kind. They ran tests for 3 days, scanning Daniel's eyes with equipment Michael had never seen before. The lead researcher, Drive, Amelia Foster, explained that Daniel's optic nerves were intact despite his underdeveloped eyes. That was the key. If the gene therapy could stimulate development in his retinal cells, his brain might learn to process visual information. The surgery was scheduled for early June. The night before, Michael couldn't sleep. He stood at the window of their hotel room, watching the lights of Philadelphia spread out below, and prayed to a God he wasn't sure he believed in. He prayed that this would work. He prayed that he hadn't given his son false hope. He prayed that whatever happened, Daniel would be okay. The surgery took 6 hours. Michael and Sarah waited in a room that smelled like industrial coffee and fear. When Dr. Foster finally emerged, she looked exhausted but cautiously optimistic. The procedure had gone well. They had successfully delivered the gene therapy to both eyes. Now they had to wait. Daniel would need to keep his eyes bandaged for 2 weeks while the genetic modification took effect. 2 weeks of darkness, which for Daniel was just normal life. He was remarkably calm about the whole thing, more concerned about missing his piano practice than about whether the treatment would work. They returned home to Portland with Daniel's eyes still covered. Michael took leave from his practice. Sarah reduced her hours. They waited. Michael counted down the days, the hours. He barely slept, running through every possible outcome in his mind. On the morning of the unveiling, they drove back to Philadelphia. Dr. Foster would remove the bandages in her office, in a controlled environment. Michael held Sarah's hand in the waiting room, both of them silent with anticipation and terror. They were called back. Daniel sat in the examination chair, calm and still. Dr. Foster explained what she was going to do. She would remove the outer bandages first, then the gauze beneath. She asked Daniel to keep his eyes closed until she said to open them. She would start with dim lighting and gradually increase it. Michael watched her hands as she unwound the white bandages. His heart was pounding so hard he felt dizzy. The gauze came away. Daniel's eyes were closed, the lids smooth and pale. Dr. Foster dimmed the lights until the room was nearly dark.